Your book, Tori? Hi, everybody. I'm Jenna Blum, Tori Whitaker's fangirl, and I'm here today with Tori Whitaker for a very special historical fiction edition on A Mighty Blaze. If you are part of Blaze Nation, welcome back. We love to see you. Thank you for bringing your light to the blaze. And if you're new to the blaze, please know we are a team of 35 creative professional volunteers dedicated to linking writers with their readers in the age of COVID, in the age of Delta, in the age of Omicron, in the age of monkeypox, and far beyond. We just want to give a digital platform to authors so that they can connect with their readers worldwide. If you like what you see here, please give us a like or a follow on Facebook, on YouTube, on Instagram, on Twitter. We are ubiquitous, and please consider signing up for our newsletter, which is www.mightyblaze.com. So you'll never have FOMO ever again. No more FOMO. Nobody likes that. And today, as I said, I am so greatly honored and thrilled to welcome my friend Tori Whitaker and her second book, A Matter of Happiness. Look at this beautiful cover. We need to talk about that, Tori. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here, Jenna.
Thank you. And I want to see your headgear. Look, can you like scooch, as they say at the OBGYN?
A little closer.
You're beautiful, amazing.
Thank you.
Where did you get this? This is my first question.
I ordered it online. When I had my book launch, I wore this and a dress with a sash low on my hips and little flapper T-strap dance shoes and some bangles and everything.
Oh my gosh.
I put the pearls and the headband on because you inspired me. I've been watching you. I remember back when you did the launch for Grand Central with all the other authors and you dressed in the 40s and everything. And so honestly, when I wore some flapper attire at my book launch, I had that in the back of my mind. I thought, I'm just going to dress up a little bit. And then I saw you yesterday on that amazing launch for your audio drama podcast. And I've already listened and I love them. And I can't wait to hear the next episode. And it was really a game day decision. I thought, based on you wearing that cute little red beret yesterday and that dress with the musical signs, I'll wear some pearls and my headband. So,
well, you look gorgeous, and I'm honored to be an inspiration. I personally write books only for the cosplay involved, or like podcasts, anything, because when you do a launch and you write historical fiction, you get to dress like a book, or in my case, dress like a podcast. And I seriously love all of this stuff, right? So obviously, I have a lot of headgear. And I will happily talk about why I do this and ask you how that's been going for you. But first, I would like to introduce you officially and also introduce your beautiful new book, Matter of Happiness. So are you ready for your official bio?
I'm ready.
Okay. Buckle up. It's you. Tori Whitaker is the best-selling author of Millicent Glenn's Last Witch, which I loved and read when it was a baby book. And A Matter of Happiness, she belongs to the Bourbon Women's Association, which obviously we need to talk about more. Thank you for holding this up. I will never get tired of looking at this cover. It's so beautiful. And the Historical Novel Society. Tori's work has appeared in the Historical Novels Review and Bookmarks magazine. She graduated from Indiana University and is an alum of Yale Writers Workshop, which sounds scary, and has recently retired. Congratulations. I have been following online from a national law firm where she served as chief marketing officer. She spent a decade in Detroit because of her husband's career in the automotive industry, which obviously we're going to talk about as well. And the two now reside near their children outside Atlanta and Foxtail Books, which everybody should go to if you're in Atlanta. And they've been married for 45 happy years. What is the secret to that? We would like to know. And you can follow Tori on Instagram, which she is a queen at. Like, I've watched you go from 0 to 100, and Facebook. And you can connect with her at www.toriwhitaker.com. Welcome.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
You have always been such an inspiration for me, way back to Those Who Save Us. Your first dual timeline. I mean, and you've inspired a lot of what I write too, and taught me a lot.
Oh my God, seriously, so honored.
Yes, absolutely.
Also, I should point out that Tori's book, A Matter of Happiness, we will discuss why this is, and hold it over here so you can all see it really well, but has given me a great reason to day drink. So I am drinking bourbon in your honor. And what kind of bourbon? Cheers. Cheers, everybody.
Cheers to all of your successes, and cheers to
yours. Cheers to A Matter of Happiness. I'm going to hold
Shall
this
we
up.
have a sip?
We shall. I am drinking Oh my God, it's so good to drink at noon. Why do I not do this more?
Mm,
I am drinking something called Ring Light. I am
I
I
love
am
it.
drinking something called Angel's Envy, which is one of my favorite bourbons, and I also love one called Writer's Tears. You
And
are
I
like
haven't heard
the
of that one.
bourbon expert. Which one are
But
we talking
an
about?
Angel's Envy I have. I've been to that distillery actually. I pulled for today Little Book, which is one of the Jim Beam products that comes out, I think, once a year. And every time it comes out, it's called a chapter. This one is Little Book, Chapter 4, Lessons Learned. And that's what I'm drinking.
I love that. Like how clever that is. And how are you drinking? You're just drinking it neat. I put ice in mine. Is that bad? Am I like a
No,
total?
that's not bad. No, lots of people put ice in theirs. I decided to just have it straight or neat today, and I'm just going to have a couple sips as we talk. But
That's so lovely. Have you
I'm
been
so
like?
glad that you're drinking a little bourbon with me today because
I,
we have
you
so
know,
much to celebrate.
why not? We both have a lot to celebrate. So have you been basically like drinking your whole tour? I have to ask you, have you been like, kind of drunk the whole tour?
Did I drink bourbon before?
I mean, during your whole tour, I want to know.
Oh,
Are you like,
yeah.
oh, I have to like
Yeah, we had a sip in a lot of places for sure. I had some punch at my launch, and then um, a couple of my book tour stops, like in the Detroit area and the Louisville area, were actually in bourbon bars.
love?
And you could have a sip or you couldn't. I mean, it was up to the people who came. And bourbon does play a key role in the story. And that's why we've got a little bit of a bourbon theme going on.
Yes, I kind of am like backing into this interview like a truck, like beep, beep, because I know Tori and we're friends. And so I'm like, oh, let's talk about the bourbon first and then talk about the book. But I think we should talk about the book and why bourbon is in the book and why we're drinking it. It's not just because we feel like celebrating and we're lushes. So, Tori, can you please tell us what A Matter of Happiness is about?
It's about two fiercely independent women who live as young women almost 100 years apart. And there's Violet in the historical timeline. It's a dual timeline story. And she is coming of age in the early 1920s. We see her evolve into a flapper. And she leaves for her great, great, great niece what I call this cherished heirloom, which is the car. And Violet had started out in Kentucky, but moved when she was 19 to the fastest growing city in America, which was Detroit at that time, with the motor car boom because she wanted to work. She had lost her job as a clerical worker in a distillery in Kentucky when Prohibition hit. And decades later, Melanie, her niece, is an up and coming rising star in a modern bourbon distillery in Kentucky. And she inherits this car and the secrets that it keeps. Nobody, until she finds this journal in the car, this 1923 red two-seater convertible, by the way, a roadster. Nobody knew in the family of quite the extent of the wild life that Violet had in her youth before she comes back to Kentucky.
Love. So, fast cars, fast women, bourbon. What is not to love here? It's a very like sexy, racy story. I remember when you told me like the basic premise of the book, I don't know, a year and a half ago, maybe I was like, oh, this one just sounds so luscious.
Yeah, you being a cheerleader made a big difference.
Oh, I'm so glad. But I mean, I think my cheerleading succeeds because I genuinely believe in what I'm cheering for. So can you tell us a little bit about the genesis of this story? Did it start with the bourbon? Did it start with the car? Did it start with the women, the setting?
It started with the car. In this case, because as you said in my intro, my husband and I had spent 10 years working in Detroit. And I had that in the back of my mind for a long time. My husband now in his semi-retirement down here in Georgia does automotive restorations for classic cars like 1930 Fords and stuff like that. And for a long time, even before I wrote Millicent, I thought, what if one of these old vintage automobiles was stored away somewhere, collecting dust and fading away for decades, and something was hidden in it for someone to find. And so that was the real kernel of the story. And then when I discovered the Jordan MX Playboy, which is this car on the cover, the 1923 Jordan was wildly popular with flappers. There was this advertising campaign that revolutionized car ads forever, and it just completely drew me in. And then, Jenna, when I found out that F. Scott Fitzgerald named Jordan Baker in The Great Gatsby after the Jordan automobile because of its association with flappers, I was just like, okay, this is the car. So it really did start with the car, but with that advertising campaign and what I learned about flappers who would love cars during that time because of the freedom that like a car symbolized, that was really how I came to be able to write Violet. She was the woman who grew up, became, like 20 years old in 1921 or something like that, 2021. And she was the modern woman who wanted freedom, who didn't want someone telling her what to do, wanted to make her own decisions, work, be independent and everything.
Mhm. I love that. This is your second book that has a back and forth, so a dual timeline, if you will, back and forth storyline between the past conversing with the present. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Like, why do you choose this? Is it your favorite? Does it choose you?
I love past and present books. And really your debut was one of the earliest ones I've read, and I've been reading them ever since. And I love them. I love that combination of the historical, because I love history and learning something, and how the modern day viewpoint in a book can also speak to that history and look back at it, and also how it affects the current day. I love that interplay. And what you'll find in this novel is Violet and Melanie very much have parallel stories. And you, as a teacher, some years ago, you really are the one who taught me that a dual timeline book, you're not going to be embarrassed by this, a dual timeline book must have three arcs: the arc of both narratives, the historical and the modern, and then the arc of the whole book. And I really take your lessons to heart there. In this story, both characters are facing issues in their workplace, whether it's 1920 Detroit or modern day Kentucky. They're facing issues with someone in their family, could be a sister or a mother, and they're facing issues with the love in their life. So those things just are universal.
Agree. And what do you think? So Melanie and Violet, they do glance together in real life when Melanie is a child and Violet
That's
is
right.
much older. And Melanie has this great nickname for her aunt, which
Yes. Grape and
is grape,
Violet.
grape and Violet, which I totally love. So
Good.
do you think, like, if they met as adults, like if Violet were able to meet Melanie as an adult, what advice would she give her based on the fact that I feel as though things have changed for women and things have not changed for women?
Well, I love that question. I think she would teach her to know what it is you want. And really that's where the title of the book came from, is both women seeking happiness as they define it for themselves. And you can change along the way. You can change your mind. You don't have to always be on the same road, no pun intended, but intended, I guess. Um, and you can be adventurous and try different things and give love a chance. She would definitely, I think, tell Melanie to give love a chance. And just because, in Melanie's case, her first engagement did not fare well, she breaks up with her fiance right before the story opens. It doesn't mean that there's not always a chance to have love again.
Mm. I love that. And tell us a little bit, without spoilers, if you can, about Violet's story, because anytime you have a book that has the dual storyline with the historical storyline and then the present storyline, I feel as though for readers, the present storyline is sometimes a welcome chance to return to our contemporary time if the history is difficult. but also like history has such a va-va-voom factor to it too, because we're like engaging our learning capability and we're learning about things we don't know. And we basically are time traveling. And so those timelines are often, even if they're sometimes scary, are like really enticing. Like, so tell
Yes.
us a little bit about Violet's storyline without giving too much away, if you would.
Okay. Well, Violet, she grew up in the 19 teens as a girl. And so she was exposed to what other things flappers, the who would become flappers, were exposed to, like silent movies with starlets that do daring stunts, and they're single and they're um, adventurous. And that sparks that, I think, and what will become flappers. And they're reading literature that goes beyond Pollyanna to things like Treasure Island, and they're hearing about Peter Pan on the stage during that day, and flying away to Never Never Land, and they have this need to be independent and free. Start there. And then in the late teens, World War I, right? The world goes to war. Some people go off, some don't come back. And then the Spanish flu, which was that era's pandemic. And there are people who don't survive. So by the time 1920 comes along, Violet, who is not quite old enough to vote with that very first vote, but boy, her mother was first in line. Okay. Her mother was quite the inspiration too. Women like Violet wanted freedom. They wanted independence, and they didn't want to be told they couldn't drive or they couldn't smoke or they couldn't wear short skirts or bare arms or drink alcohol. They went into the man's domain of the barber shops and got their hair bobbed off, and they went dancing all night. And we know, looking back, that era comes to a close with the start of the stock market crash and then the depression. And by the 1950s, society has women being back in the home, right, as
Mhm.
mainly homemakers. Um, so it was really an era where these women were wild and free. But with that, it's not always happy. Well, I meant to bring a Baby Ruth and I forgot, but Baby Ruth candy bars came out in 1921. And there was a scene in my book where this barnstormer comes down into Detroit in the city, dropping hundreds of Baby Ruth candy bars. It happened in 40 cities across the country, or 40 states. And it was a big marketing campaign. And one of the lines is, though candy may rain from the sky, though candy bars may rain from the sky, life will not always be sweet. I would see that as a
Mm.
theme that's threaded throughout. And
Mm.
Violet needs to learn this, and Melanie needs to learn. It's not always going to be fun and games, but you survive and you decide what's right for you. And these women are faced with choices, and they make decisions. They have things thrown at them, and then they do things that are kind of messed up too. And um, they have to get through that. Melanie is helped by the words of Violet through Violet's journal. Even though Melanie's having problems with her mother's a little overbearing and very demanding and has a lot of expectations for Melanie. And she's coming to terms with that, and she's coming into her own.
I love this because it gives a sort of moral nourishment to the book as well. Like if you read this, you're getting these lessons by osmosis that life will not always be sweet, but you sort of soldier on. And I'm really struck by, while you're talking, the fact I think about this a lot. My grandmother was born in 1900. And
Oh,
in
yeah.
fact, by the time she was 18, she had lived through, the invention of the automobile and like bringing it into the farm community, but also the First World War and
Mhm.
also the pandemic. And I think about, if she were still alive, she would be like 120 years old. So not really possible. But those are the people who remember the last pandemic and how different it would have been to not have Zoom and to not be connected and to really be locked in your house and have people dying and get your only news from the newspaper or like maybe a radio if you were lucky. But how that would shape a young woman's character. And it's so fascinating to me to think about. We have our lives, and maybe from our 20s to our 60s and 70s, we have agency where we have the physical agency to participate in our own lives and the emotional agency as we grow. And that's a pretty narrow window. It's like 40 or 50 years in a whole span of history. If your life intersects at like a time when there's freedom for women and there are all these galvanic changes, it really shapes your character in a very specific way. And if you're born into the 50s and then your life spans from the 50s to like the 90s, that agency, then that's like shapes you in a different way. Mm-hmm. How do you think that Violet and Melanie have been shaped differently, if they have been?
Violet had a more get along relationship with her mother. Her mother was inspirational, and her mother saw that women could want and have things that she couldn't want and have. She saw that, and she wanted those for Violet. She encouraged Violet to go off at age 19 alone to a big city, from Kentucky to Detroit. I mean, think about it today. Even today, a young woman doing that, that's kind of a big thing when you relocate all by yourself. She had a room and a boarding house lined up. She had a job lined up and an automotive supplier factory making spark plugs. And her mother supported her. I think what we'll find with Melanie's mother is that Melanie perceives her mother to be less supportive than maybe her mother is. And she was an only child. And so that's one key difference between the characters is Melanie has a contentious relationship with her mother, and there might be a blowout coming. I don't know.
Maybe. It's like both of your books too. So we're talking a little bit about the characters' individual psychological palette, if you will, as opposed to how they are shaped by that sort of Ferris wheel of historic circumstance. But this is a theme of yours in both of your books, in Millicent Glenn's Last Wish and also in Matter of Happiness. The mother-daughter thing and the mother-daughter-grandmother thing, that sort of paper doll thread that links women through the generations. This is one of your main themes. Why is that?
I think it's because I was born into a 5-generation family. And I just can't help myself. I find myself writing and not even realizing that I've got characters that are 5 generations apart or 3 generations apart. I mean, I kind of know it going in, but then I don't even know how to explain it. So that's one reason. Not only was I born into a 5-generation family as the 5th living generation, but then my grandchildren came along years later, and my family was 5 living generations again, which is really rare. And so I just can't help but think in terms of ancestors and descendants and great greats, you know. But one thing that is not of my experience is the contentious relationships between the mothers and daughters. That people who do developmental editing for me in the past, like yours truly, you, Jenna, and my editors at the publisher, they want me to dig deeper and to try to bring out more conflict between the mother and daughter in the modern day setting. And that's at once really fun for me and really hard, because my mother and I never had that kind of relationship ever. But my mother always said when we were growing up, or maybe when I was maybe like in my 20s or 30s or something, she would say, "I'm so glad all you kids get along, because it's not like that in all families, you know." And so that was kind of in the back of my mind too, that I can write about a family that's not getting along with, say, Melanie and her mother, Angie, even though that's not from my experience. But the generational part certainly is.
Sorry, I didn't mean to step on your foot there, but I'm fascinated by that because I loved my mom, and she was also like Aurora Greenway in terms of endearment, like the main character in terms of endearment, except with red hair and always smoking, and she was like very provocative. So she and I had a friendship, but we also had a really contentious relationship.
Did you?
And it's true, like it's not the same in all families, and in fact, in most of my work, the mom, forgive me, is dead. And that happened when my mom was alive, which really insulted her. She's like, why can't the mom just be on a trip in Germany or something? Like, why does she have to be dead? And it's because my mom had such a strong personality that anything I put her in, she would eclipse or like pull toward her like a really powerful moon. And so I could write about that easily, but I don't, because unless I'm writing directly about that relationship, I can't write about it because it will hijack the actual subject. So how do you create something that you haven't experienced emotionally? Like, I would love to talk more about the research for this book also, but just the emotional research. Like, how do
Mhm.
you do that if you're in a family where everybody gets along?
Well, sometimes little things of your own life will slip into a story, and like I can identify it because it comes to my mind, and then I can sort of explode it out to be more of a big deal than it ever was. Say,
Mm.
like, later in the novel where Melanie has this memory of being a little girl and wanting to be a cheerleader and not making it when she tried out, and what that meant for her in her life of she hadn't done her best, she felt in retrospect. And so she's really trying to do her best to get this promotion and to make her mother proud of her and all of these things. And so you can take a little thing like that and make more layers and meaning out of it, I think. For me, what about you? I mean, when you write about something, say that you haven't experienced, do you call on something that kind of relates to it and blow it up, or do you just do so much research that you make it up, or what?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. Most of the things that I write about, I was just talking about this on my previous interview,
Oh,
are emotionally things that are really pressing to me. So if there's a sort of Easter egg of author buried in my fiction, which there always is, like that's always the emotional situation for me. And I can't write about something that doesn't have an emotional heart for me personally. So if somebody says to me at a party, which they sometimes do, "Oh, you're a writer, you should write this story," or "You're a writer, I have a great story for you." It's such a kind impulse on their part, but I can't do it because I have to write from a situation in my own life and like an emotional situation in my own life where I have to do a lot of the research. The sort of monkey bars legwork is in the historical setting or in the historical elements. And so I wanted to ask you about that as well. I guess there is also an element of imaginative empathy. So, for instance, in my third
yes.
book, I'm writing from the point of view in the first third of the book of a man, like a male Holocaust survivor who opens a restaurant. It was actually one of my favorite things to do ever was to jump into a man's head and a
Mm,
man's body and try to figure out how a man would navigate that situation, a man of that culture, of that time, of a different country, of his mindset.
Peter.
Peter, yes, exactly, of his sort of diffident personality. How would Peter negotiate a circumstance that I might negotiate differently? But the emotional question that I was grappling with in those pages is something that's very near and dear to me, which is how do people survive trauma and how
Yeah.
do they rebuild in the aftermath, and how does the sort of eternal optimism of the human spirit, like how does that interact with like actual people,
Mhm.
and cause conflict, and how do they get around conflict? So that's a theme that I reheat over and over because I'm fascinated by it, but it was in a different person's body and experience. I loved that. So,
And I
yeah.
think you had a really good sentence in there too, where you said that you put yourself in the other people's position, um, and I absolutely do that as well.
Mhm. Isn't that a joy? I mean, like most of
Yeah.
us don't get to step out of our own skins and experience life from another perspective.
Mhm.
But writing gives you the chance not only to do armchair travel or
Yeah.
time travel, it gives you like,
Right.
if you're doing it hopefully successfully, like living life through another person's eyes, it's so great.
Well, one example of that in the book is the character Leela, who is the best
Mhm.
friend of Violet in the 1920s, and she is the quintessential flapper, um, that Violet is aspiring to be. She knows she wants it. She wants the certain things, but then she meets Leela in a speakeasy, and they become fast friends. And Leela was a fascinating character for me to write, being that woman who she was. She was open to being with different men back in that time, and she taught Violet how to smoke cigarettes. And she came from a wealthy family, not old money Detroit, but Otto Baron type new money family, very rich. And so it's kind of fun putting yourself in those situations. And yeah.
The whole book is set
How
in
would
this
you
very,
feel?
sorry, go
Yeah.
ahead. I stepped on you
Sorry.
again.
How did you feel in that position, Leela?
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. The whole era is so luscious. Like the whole flapper era, it's a very Fitzgerald era, as you said. Like the Jordan, the car is named after, or Jordan, the character is named after Jordan, the car. And I think you chose wisely. Like you chose a time, again, of fast cars, supposedly fast women, women's sort of emancipation, but in this very sexy way. And then you also have a modern day character who works in a bourbon distillery. Like hats off, like fascinators off to you. Like this is a really good mix. What was, I know we have questions about research that I will pass on to my producer in a moment, but what was the most fun part of the research for you?
Well, it was definitely fun going to the Bourbon Trail, of course, through Kentucky. My husband and I had done that 10 years ago, and the bulk of my research during this book was during COVID. But when it finally opened up some, when I think I might have already been in revisions with my editor, we went again. And I mean, distilleries are like going to Sonoma Valley or something, going to a winery. I mean, you go, you get a tour, or they've got this lovely visitor center, and you can have a little sip of something, and they impart the history of the place that sometimes goes back generations, and that's fun. The research on flappers was particularly fun for me, and I've touched on that. Um, I would say just Detroit. I didn't know, even though I worked in the city for 10 years, there were things about it during Prohibition that I hadn't known. Like it was a hub of bootlegging and rum running during Prohibition, one of the biggest hubs in the country, just being a river away from Canada where they still produced alcohol. And the rum runners from Detroit would go over and take a bunch of it by the boatload, literally, and come back. And these underground networks distributed it. So at the time in Detroit, you've got a confluence of a lot of things. You've got Prohibition, where they actually started a couple of years before the National Amendment. And so those rum runners and bootleggers knew what they were doing already. They had a jump start on how to make this happen. A lot of speakeasies, of course, and stuff. And but also there's an explosion in the population with the Great Migration and workers coming up from the South to get jobs in the automotive industry, and immigrants coming from Poland and Germany and Russia, and getting jobs there, and farmers from all over the Midwest, and women, young women coming to get jobs, certain jobs that they could do as well. And so it was just a fascinating time to be in Detroit with that, automotive boom, I thought.
Super.
And I've read novels before set in Prohibition that are often set in Chicago or New York or something. I hadn't seen anything in Detroit, and I still have a piece of my heart there. So that's where we went. And Jenna, I tried to juxtapose the era of Prohibition where you're not making alcohol legally with today's bourbon boom, really. I mean, there's been 2,000 bourbon distilleries open up in the country across all 50 states in the last 10 years. So with that, we're going to have a sip. Okay.
Yeah, I think every time you say bourbon, we have to drink. So everybody out in the audience, if you haven't gotten your bourbon already, go get your bourbon. Now I have to drink. I said bourbon, I have to drink 3 times. So that's what I'm going to do while you talk. I actually think Detroit and a lot of the quote Rust Belt cities are really overlooked. One of my favorite books of the year is called The Rabbit Hutch by Tess Gunty, because it's set in a housing development that is in Indiana. So I think it's just such an overlooked thing. And when I have driven through these areas on book tour, when I'm storm chasing or like visiting friends, I'm so struck by the fact that these cities were built by like big business money, like robber baron money. They have such incredible histories with gangsters and with prohibition, as you said, with like drug running and like gun running. And now there are these sort of, especially in Detroit, I was there a few years ago for an event, and I have a college boyfriend who lives there who works for Border Patrol. And so he was like driving me all over the city. And there's
Are you kidding me?
No, I'm not. It was
Oh
great.
my gosh.
We went out to dinner, we caught up, and then he's like, let's go on a little tour of Detroit. And I'm like, let's do it. So we had this really flossy dinner in a French restaurant. We went to his house, which is in Grosse Pointe, where every lawn is manicured with a tweezer. Beautiful,
Right.
huge mansions, these lush lawns. And then we drove over the border into downtown Detroit. And then there were all of these houses that were mansions that were crumbling and uninhabited. And the grass was as tall as I was. And they were these beautiful, gloomy houses. And there was so much like drug activity. And I was like, this is literally 2 blocks away from your neighborhood, which is one of the wealthiest in the country. And a lot of the cities in the Midwest are like this. And I love them. Like, I think they speak such volumes about our nation's history. And I'm so glad that you set this story in Detroit and in Kentucky to like bring us to places that we don't automatically associate with like, oh, grand historical movement, but they are our country's history. Like, I love that you did this. So,
Well, and to add on to that, Jenna, because the bourbon distilling industry was, oh, there you go, was dead after Prohibition. I mean, there were 200 distilleries in Kentucky when Prohibition hit, and 6 of them got to continue selling bourbon as a medicinal thing, right? And so it became very depressed, the farmers and the small towns that depended on distilleries and everything. And we see that Detroit isn't maybe what it was in its heyday, right? I like to think that it too can rebound, and there's people there working and new industry that hopefully it can come back around in the same way bourbon did in Kentucky.
absolutely.
If not automotive, then the other things that they're working to do. I hope to see that someday. And I mean, it's coming along, I think, from what I'm reading.
I totally agree with you. And I think at my most optimistic, I continue to think that America is a country of reinvention. And we've seen this with like places like Nantucket or New York, or they've sort of striations of experience in every city that boom and bust cycles bring. But I'm really glad that we're getting to know Detroit better through your work, because I think it's so.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
So we have some
love letter.
Interviews a love letter, but I mean, no, it's like really interesting. And the book is also like a great love letter to these places, and I'm a big fan of place in fiction. So we have some amazing audience questions. I'm going to bounce from my question about research to a question about research, which is, was the research for the book challenging, and where do you find your sources? Which is a great question.
It was definitely challenging because there was so much of it. I mean, we're talking the bourbon industry, the automotive industry, Michigan, Kentucky, the modern day, the historical part, just everything from what kind of heat did they have in a car in 1920, if at all, to where would my character in Louisville live today? And I interviewed some young women in their 20s that gave me some ideas of here's where they'd live, here's where they'd eat, here's where they'd go for a drink after work. And I mean, there was a lot of that I could do remotely during COVID and interviewing experts, whether it's on the Jordan or whether it's on the history of bourbon. But yeah, there was just so many angles that I would say that was the greatest challenge of the research. I read 100 books plus, read a lot of online sources, from dissertations to YouTube things of how they wore their makeup in 1923 to the kinds of clothes they wore. And I could see those things and get pictures of it. I love talking about their clothes and their makeup and stuff like that. And there was just a lot.
It's so interesting because it's the opposite experience you hear a lot of people talk about, where they're like, there are no sources about this. So there's like one source, or I had to go to this really obscure archive to get my source to do this research or whatever. And yours sounds like a kind of a winnowing down. I think we're in your study, right? Your beautiful study with the paint color that I'm a little obsessed with. It's like this sort of like amazing depression, green, mint green. Did you have like an image board in your study? Did you work from images? Did you listen to the music at the time?
Yeah, I wouldn't officially call it an image board, but like here I had a map right here next to my computer a map of Detroit in right around 1920, and the cities, and I mean the streets and the blocks and everything. Um, and some of those streets are still today, and some have been changed into other things. And so I had to be very mindful of that as I was placing where was this going to be, or how would they get there, you know. And then over here, you can't see it, back behind my computer over there, I had pictures of women who inspired me to be Violet and Leela, and Violet's sister Evelyn, and the kinds of things they wore. There was one outfit in there that's kind of a bathing suit with an umbrella, and I had that hanging up there with the polka dots, and that made it into the book. And so, yes, and I did listen to music, bought some CDs, and did some Pandora of music over a period of 2 years of the 20s jazz music, and that kind of thing, the piano and the horns. And but I don't listen to the music while I'm writing. I do that outside of the office typically. When I'm in here working, I've got to just close the door, get in a zone. And if I'm bawling, it's all hanging out in here. I would never be one to write in a coffee shop. Couldn't do it. What about
Same.
you?
I kind of wish I could. I eavesdrop on people too much to be able to write in public, and I'm too easily distracted. I'm like squirrel, somebody's saying or doing something interesting, but it's true. And I am the same way. I will shut myself in a room. There, I have the images up, and I listen to the music, but only outside of the study, like to keep myself in the atmosphere of the book when I'm not working. But it's such a great tool. Do you have a Spotify playlist for us to listen to? I bet the era music is so fun.
Gosh, I don't. But all I know is that we have it on my husband's Pandora, and I listen typically to the CDs. But that would be cool. I should put that together.
Yeah, to
and
give
post
you
that on my website.
more work. Yeah, could you please do that? That'd be great. And guys, don't forget to go to Tori's website, which is www.toriwhitaker.com, because there's a lot of behind the scenes stuff. Thank you to my producer for popping that up. Let's do another question. Does the story give light to the reason behind the non-supporting mom's action? I'm fascinated with those storylines. Great question, Sylvia. And thank you for joining us.
That is. That's a really insightful question. And the answer is yes. We as readers don't know that. In fact, Melanie doesn't understand it for a time, but her mother will eventually tell her that as much pressure as she puts on Melanie, not to give too much of a spoiler, but Melanie's mother had been put under pressure as well. We'll leave it at that.
That's a very elegant way to answer that question. But so there is sort of like a burr under the psychological saddle, so to speak, that like makes
it's very motivated.
Right. Now you have to write the book and read the book. If you guys want to know what that is, you got to buy the book. And then we have one more question, which is, which character was the most fun to write and explore? Also such a fun question.
Well, between Melanie and Violet, I think Violet was more fun to write and explore. But Leela was also really fun to write too, and she's a secondary character. Because she was just so, she's the one that's going to say more cuss words, and you can relate to that, right?
Oh yes.
And just the things that she would wear and the attitudes. She had absolutely no inhibition.
Love this in a character. So fun to watch. I also think that the secondary characters, what I call the best supporting players, if we were going to do that Oscars, rundown of the book when it's turned into a movie or series, I think that they steal the scene sometimes. And I'm laughing about the cuss words because in the podcast that I just dropped, there's a side character named Moxie Di Lorenza.
I love her.
Totally love. Thank you. I also love her very much. And when I was writing, she kind of like was stealing the show, but she's like a tough, trash talking, swearing, like truck driver mouth.
Yeah, she just lays it on the line.
She does, yeah. She's like a Italian American from Boston, and she's always going to say what she thinks, and she's so great. She was super fun to
The actor is doing a great job with her too, I think.
Thank you. So I just dropped this historical podcast yesterday from Emerald Audio Network, and it's on all the platforms, and it's called Key of Love. It's historical romance, and it is like a radio play. So it's acted with a cast of actors. It has original music, and I have been honestly so busy with the promo that I've only had the chance to listen to the first episode. But I'm so in love with it, so obsessed, and like what an honor to have your work brought to life by a whole cast and by sound effects and by music, and I'm agog with the whole thing.
Right. And I love it because I love audiobooks anyway. But this is different from a standard narration where you get these actors doing it, like you say, with all the sound effects and everything. And so for me, it has that. I'm going to love it because I love audio, but it also is in 20 or 30-minute chunks, like a podcast, where you can do it in a chunk. And then, oh my gosh, the cliffhangers, though, cruel, just cruel.
Thank you. Love good, cruel cliffhanger. That is my jam. Right. It's like really fun to do. But thank you for.
I'll have to listen next Thursday.
Thank you. I will too. Like, I have not heard the episodes before they drop, so I listen alongside everybody else.
I don't know how you can stand it.
I mean, luckily I know the story, but it was really fun to write. There are 8 episodes. They drop every Thursday. So wherever you are listening to your podcast, if you put in the Key of Love, you'll hear it. I'm going to go listen to episode 2 after our interview, now that I've had some lovely bourbon. Tori, what would you like to say to your readers about A Matter of Happiness and Millicent Glenn's Last Wish, like about your 2 books, but especially about the release of this book? What would you like to say to your fans?
Well, I love hearing from my readers and meeting them on my book tour and everything. And I'm very engaging on Instagram and things like that. So reach out to me or email me through my website. But what I've learned just since the book came out 4 weeks ago is that one of the things resonating with the readers is how women have these same kinds of issues, whether it's 100 years ago or now. They might be a little bit different, but they're still dealing with some of the issues. And it feels good for that to be resonating. And also, I want them to take away that though candy bars may rain from the sky, life will not always be sweet, but go on adventures, love and be loved, and you can choose your own happiness.
Oh my God, I love that. Like, literally cry. I love that. Thank you so much. There's like no better way to conclude our interview, although I could talk to you all day, but go out, choose your happiness. I guess you could flip it and say life will not always be sweet, but candy bars will sometimes rain from the sky.
Yeah, right. I like that too.
So everybody, holidays are coming. Go buy 4, 5, 6 copies of A Matter of Happiness. Make somebody happy this holiday season. Make many people happy and buy it for everybody you know who loves historical fiction, mother-daughter story, the 20s, flappers, candy bars, cars. Just a really, really good read. Like, go to bookshop, go to Foxtail, buy it. Right,
and you are such a jewel. And I don't know how you have the energy to do everything you're doing and looking so beautiful as you do it. and you're such a support to the whole book community and to authors individually. I'm honored that you had me on today. Thank you.
Oh my gosh. I'm so proud of you, sweetheart. Go forth, drink bourbon, sell lots of books. Love you. Happy holidays. Thank you for joining us, everybody. Cheers and have a wonderful holiday season. Go buy books, read, buy more books, drink more bourbon, buy more books.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.